Hey guys, today I am going to give a class called Sacrifice and Obedience. And of course, I'm going to talk about King Saul because he's where we get where God says, or where Prophet Samuel says that God says that obedience is better than sacrifice. So when we look at the life of King Saul, God had given him a commandment to go and kill all the Amalekites because of their evil towards Israel years before. And he says, destroy everything. Easy task. He knows, the king knows he's going to win the war because God told him, go kill the Amalekites. But then sure enough, when Prophet Samuel comes to King Saul, actually, God speaks to Prophet Samuel and says, what does he say? He said, I regret making King Saul king. The only two times in the Bible I remember God saying that he regrets something is number one, when he says he regrets having created creation because of how evil they were, and that's when Noah makes the ark. And number two, when he says that he regrets making King Saul king. Ouch. That must be really hard for King Saul. So Prophet Samuel goes to see King Saul, and King Saul is all happy and he's celebrating and he's like, we obeyed God. And in his eyes, the Bible says that a man's ways are right in his own eyes. In his eyes, hey, he did good. And Prophet Samuel's like, really? Then why do I hear cattle and why do I hear sheep? And well, King Saul starts giving excuses. Yeah, but we saved them because we saved the best of them to give sacrifices unto our God. And the king, he didn't kill the king of the Amalekites. That was another one. So Prophet Samuel was like, don't you know that obedience is better than sacrifice, and rebellion is like the sin of oh my goodness. He does say idolatry, but before idolatry, he says, he does say witchcraft, of course, but he uses another word. I think it's divination or something like that. And he says, he's like what you did was horrible, Basically, in other words, he didn't say what you did was horrible. So that was the second time King Saul had disobeyed. The first time, it's when he was going to go fight against the Philistine army. And Prophet Samuel had said, go and wait for me and we'll do a burnt offering together. But King Saul instead became fearful because his men were fearful and his men were leaving, and his men, he cared too much what men thought, and he did something out of the flesh instead of obeying God. And he went ahead and he did the offering himself without Prophet Samuel. And sure enough, when he finished doing that burnt offering, right then and there, Samuel showed up, Prophet Samuel showed up, and he's like, what did you do? And he's like, well, you were taking long. So there we go, another excuse to validate his excuse, to validate his reasoning. Well, you were taking long, so we had to do this. And Prophet Samuel said, well, you've done foolishly. So it wasn't like God, regretted making King Saul for one mistake. It was a continuous thing. This was what was in his heart. And even though he would excuse it, and he couldn't see how wrong it was before God. Because again, the Bible says that a man's ways are good in his own eyes. But we see in the Bible that there's a lot of times where men and women had to make sacrifices that were very hurtful, and I can see why they were torn. Even, for example, when Abraham, God tells him he's going to have a son, but Abraham, he's like, okay, well, nothing's happening. So his wife is like, well, take the maidservant and be with her. And he takes Hagar. She's half Egyptian, it's completely off. That's not what God told him. And they have Ishmael. And then God, after a few years, is like, that's not what I told you. That didn't come from me. That came from your flesh. That was in human efforts. I don't need human effort helps, And he allows Sarah to conceive, and they have Isaac, the promised child. And here Abraham is all happy. He has his promised child. And then one day God says, I want that promised child. Give him to me. Kill him. Imagine how confused. Maybe not confused, but how this didn't make any sense to Abraham. He's like, what, Lord, what are you doing? I don't understand. You told me you were going to give me a son. It was the wrong son. Okay, fine. God even told him one time to because his wife Sarah was like, oh, take the maidservant's son away, take Ishmael out of here. And he was torn. He had to choose again. They'll have to take my son away. And God said, don't fear to take him out, because that's not the promised son. I'm going to bless him, but don't fear. So he had to give up Ishmael. Now he has to obey God and kill his promised son that he was finally convinced that this is the son God gave me. And he goes and he obediently does it. Guys, how many of us would be like Abraham? I don't think so. I don't think a lot of us would actually, I think a lot of us think, yeah, we would. But when you're there, it's not as easy said as it is done. But Abraham goes and, an angel comes and says, don't kill your son. God was just testing you. Doesn't everyone that's been through a test wish that would happen to them? Just kidding. It was just a test. You passed. But yeah, so Abraham went through that. I think of Hannah, Prophet Samuel's mother. She couldn't have kids. She actually went to the temple to cry out to God, and Eli, the priest, the Levite, who didn't have any discernment when it came towards her because he accused her of being drunk and completely rebuked her for being drunk. And she's like, I'm not drunk. I haven't been drinking. I'm just crying out to God for a son. And sure enough, he blesses her and prays over her, and she has the son. And now she has to give her son to God. A woman who's waited for this son for years. I can only imagine days before she had to turn in her son to Eli to serve in the temple, how torn this woman must have been. But she knew that God was good and that God would bless her. And he did. So what was it that King David said when he was going to buy the field? He said, I'm not going to give something to God that does not cost me. That woman that poured out that oil, that perfume to anoint Jesus before his burial, she gave a very high, costly perfume. So, Jesus says, he says, carry your cross and follow me daily. The gospel is not a gospel of just comfort and just everything is, hey, it's about dying to the flesh. It's about obeying God. It's about becoming like Jesus, So, so many examples. We see Ruth and Orpah, her sister-in-law, and we see how